Give it up for Renya Shea. Come on up, Renya.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be back here and to see everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces. It's good to see some newer. Hello? Yes? Okay, great. Like I was saying, it's really an honor to be back here. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces, but also to see a lot of new faces, too. And I hope that some of the findings that we have will benefit everyone here today. So, for those of you who weren't here last year, I was, kind of going around, bothering everyone, saying, please fill out my survey, please fill out my survey. So thank you for those who filled it out. And now, a year later, we've been working really hard on, perfect, thank you. We've been working really hard on kind of nailing down what were the information we got out of that. And we're here today to kind of share some of our findings with you. All right. So first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge some people that had a huge hand in making this project possible. Dr. Hopkin, who's here today, was my main advisor, and we worked on this together for a very long period of time. Some people that were equally as important but weren't able to be here today: Ashley Brazil, who's another genetic counselor, Valentina, our statistician, and Kelly Wersinski, another student who also helped me out a lot. And then finally, obviously, the 1p36 Deletion Support and Awareness Organization. You guys welcomed me. Everyone was very friendly last year, helped me fill out surveys. You supported me in many different ways throughout the project, and special thanks to Todd for answering my numerous emails throughout the year and being a big support in completing this project as well. All right, without further ado, we can move on to what we were doing. So the main purpose of our project was pretty simple. We wanted to describe the impact that 1p36 deletion syndrome had on families. We were hoping that, at the very least, just describing the impact and addressing it, acknowledging that it exists, can lead to a healthier mental state in families. Just knowing what is going on with other families, knowing what are the challenges, can possibly lead to families feeling like, they're not isolated, they're not the only ones feeling this way. And then eventually, a healthier caregiver also leads to a better quality care for the 1p36 individual as well. So, in terms of the background, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but you're all familiar that there are several different body systems that are involved with our, with the little kiddos with 1p36. We know that there's quite a bit of developmental delay. There's sometimes other involvements, like with behavioral problems. There's sometimes, muscle weakness going on. We have the characteristic facial features, those cute little faces we see everywhere. We got sometimes intellectual disability. Some kids have seizures. So it's quite variable. And just kind of taking a scan through this room, I can tell that, it's very different from every kid to the next kid, and from every individual to the next individual. The symptoms can be very variable. So what we did was, we looked at a lot of publications, and we knew that in the past, there have been multiple publications on 1p36, a lot of them focusing on kind of the phenotype or the facial, or the characteristics that we can see with our eyes, or the phenotype-genotype correlation, which basically means kind of the things that you see as it correlates to maybe the size of the deletion, as it correlates maybe to the genes that are missing and the genetic information. But we have also most recently had another study published by Brazil et al. That Dr. Hopkin was also involved in, that kind of described what were the kind of the progression of 1p36. So they described it in more adolescents and adults, because at the time that was also lacking. There was a lot of publications on infants and children, but we haven't quite gotten any on kids that were a little bit older. And I think that was also very helpful for parents to have, because as their kids got older, they were having less and less information out there. All right, so next up, we know in general that family impact of having chronic health condition it's out there. There's been studies done before, and we know that there could be a significant impact both psychologically and emotionally in families. We know, as rewarding as it is, and as much as every parent I've spoken to has said that they've learned so much from their kids and they feel like they wouldn't change a thing, it's still okay to admit that, it's still also a lot of work, and it still can cause some emotional and physical strains as well. And so, moving from that and knowing that there is some type of impact in general, we were hoping to narrow it down and knowing what are the most challenging parts for caregivers of individuals with 1p36. So we know also that providing family-centered care has just been essential in the past. When you provide family-centered care and when you care for the entire family and the caregivers and the siblings versus looking at the kid as a patient and just kind of going through the motions, the entire family is much more satisfied because it feels like we're treating the person and we're treating the family versus treating a condition or treating a patient. Finally, tying this back to what our purpose was, we had really two main goals, by aiming to identify what were the aspects of the caregivers' lives were that would need additional support. Where can we, us as healthcare providers, fill in those gaps? And to do that, we worked on this project, and hopefully our aim was basically that we could incorporate these services that we can add into a family-centered care. And then finally, we can also just provide some anticipatory guidance, letting family members know that your kid is 3 years old now. A lot of parents said that later on when their kids are a little bit bigger, they have X and Y challenges. Your kid is 5 now, at age 10, maybe this is something that might be coming, so you're not blindsided, but it might be a challenge. And it's not always the same. We all know that every parent's journey and every caregiver's journey has been different, but at least letting them know that it's a possibility. All right. So we're going to get a little bit technical now with going through the methods of what we did, but I'll try to brush over it as quickly as I can. In terms of participants, so we had people last year from the Florida conference fill out the surveys, and we made sure that it was caregivers that were kind of either in some shape or form either parents or grandparents or boyfriends of moms, girlfriends of dads, and so on, but not someone who was paid to care for the kids, because we wanted to get data from people who were actual caregivers versus someone who was doing this as a job or as a babysitter. That was one of our big criteria, and it was basically what we wanted, the firsthand information directly from the caregivers. What we collected, if you recall, was there was 3 sections. We had kind of a basic demographics questionnaire, and then we had our validated tool, which was the Pediatric Quality of Life Family Impact Model. And this is a tool that has been validated in the past to use to measure family impact, and it's been used with several other conditions as well. And so we gave that survey out, and if you recall, there were kind of questions that measured different dimensions, and I'll go through that a little bit later. And then finally, we had caregiver-reported characteristics, because we wanted to know what were the different characteristics that the individual kids had, that the individual caregivers were dealing with, so that we can see if there were any correlations between any of the scores and any of the actual characteristics that their kids had or the symptoms that their kids had. So going back to the PEDS-QL model, it has about 8 dimensions, and it measures different aspects. So you can see there's physical, emotional, social, and cognitive functioning, and then we move on to communication, worry, family relationships, and daily activities. So these are different aspects of caregivers' lives that we were measuring, kind of. And for each of these dimensions, if you recall, there were questions under each dimension, and the questions would go something like this. So, for example, it would be, I feel tired during the day, and then parents were asked to kind of rate from 0, which is I never feel tired during the day, which I think is a lie for all of us, to kind of 4, which is almost always. So, and then after we got this data, what we did was we performed some statistical analyses. So we kind of got the mean, the median, which kind of described the data. And then we also had a little bit more advanced statistics in terms of comparing results between different types of caregivers, between caregivers, and the reported characteristics of their kids. And so we did some further analyses. So in terms of results, I just want to give you all a round of applause, because we got 56 surveys back, which was great. So that was 56 people who took time out of their day to fill this out. And that was a lot more than we were hoping for, so thank you again. Looking over the results in terms of demographics, it's kind of, we have more females than males, and then it makes sense that we have more mothers than fathers who filled out the survey. And then looking up next in terms of the kids themselves, we had kind of equal parts, about a little bit over 50% of kids that were older than 5, and then maybe about 39% of kids that were 0 to 5. I'm sorry if you can't see the colors very well. I'll try to speak up some of the numbers. And then in terms of the male versus female for the kids with 1p36, it was fairly equal, with about 45% male and 53% female from the ones that were reported. So we had about equal amounts of girls versus boys. All right, so for the 1p36 individuals themselves, what were some of the medical features that was reported? We saw that quite a few, almost like everybody said their kids had muscle weakness, gross and fine motor delay, and then we also had a little bit less than 50% report that their kids were unable to maybe walk without some extra help, or couldn't walk at all. Some kids had seizures, some brain malformations, and so on. But next up, looking at the behavioral features, and this is kind of what we focus on in our study, is that there was about 44% that were excessively friendly. And if you remember, we described excessively friendly as, maybe your kid was atypically friendly to people, to strangers, that it was a little bit kind of outside the norm, or they would kind of smile at strangers. They would maybe even, you would be worried that they'd walk away with a stranger if they were nice enough to them. That's kind of how we described excessively friendly. And then about 42 reported altered behavior in their kids. And for altered behavior, it was described more as aggressive behavior, so temper tantrums or self-injuring behavior, or any behavior that you kind of would say is a little bit challenging to handle. And then we also looked at kids who are unable to communicate using assisted technology or sign language, and then also individuals who are unable to verbally communicate. And we had almost 50% with kids who weren't able to communicate with assisted technology, and over 50% who weren't able to verbally communicate. And between that, about 29% couldn't do either, so it was difficult for parents to communicate with some of their kids. So now we're getting into some of the numbers, and just bear with me. I'm going to try to not make you fall asleep at 8 a.m., but basically what I want you to look at here is just the ovals. The total impact score is kind of the whole score of everything we looked at. So it's the average. So we have our 56 people that responded, and our average is 51.8. So that means that about kind of right in the middle. The score is out of 100, so it's basically 0 to 100, whereas 0 is kind of doing really bad, and then 100 doing really, really well. And so 50 is kind of in the middle right there, where parents reported that they weren't doing exceptionally great, and there were definitely some struggles out there, being kind of right in the middle at 51. That's kind of low. And then if you look at the second oval that's looking at all the other numbers, that's the average for each individual dimension. So looking at the physical, emotional, cognitive, and so on. And with those numbers, again, they're kind of right in the middle across the board, with being in the 50s and 40s. And if you kind of look at the line right before the end for daily activities, that's where we have the lowest number, and it's 33. So that's fairly low, 33.9 for daily activities. That was the average reported by all the parents. So 33, if you're looking at a scale of 0 to 100 and someone reports that they're feeling, tired almost 70% of the time because then the number is so low, this can, if you think about it, it's probably because daily activities is what people are going through every day. Right now is your daily activity, and it's the freshest in everyone's minds. Things like going to the grocery store, picking up the dry cleaning, those are the things most disturbed in your life by kids, whether they have 1p36 or they're typical kids. It's the things that kind of make caregivers exhausted from day to day. So next up, what we did was for each dimension, so cognitive, communication, physical, etc., we compared parents who said yes or no to specific clinical features. So here we have cardiomyopathy, congenital heart defects, and so on. So parents who said yes or no to very specific features, and then we compared the average results of those parents. So did the parents who said yes, their kid has this, have a much higher score than the people who said no, our kid doesn't have this? And for this, instead of looking at all these numbers, we'll again kind of glance over some of them. And excessive friendliness was one that came up, and it was significant. Parents who had kids who were excessively friendly were significantly having lower scores for their cognitive functioning total than parents who said no, our kids weren't excessively friendly, which is, at first you might think is kind of strange. But then we see a pattern. Excessive friendliness comes up again with daily activities. The parents who said yes, their kids, had excessive friendliness, again scored on average lower, significantly lower than the parents who reported no, their kids don't have that. And then that again came up with altered behavior. Parents who said yes, their kids had altered behavior had significantly lower scores in terms of family relationships. Looking at the next slide, we have emotional functioning totals, and then we have altered behavior and excessive friendliness come up again. Both significant again, and both parents who said yes, their kids had these traits had lower overall scores than parents who said no, their kids didn't have these traits. So one last time, social functioning, altered behavior comes up again, and the total impact score, which is basically the average for all of the different dimensions put together, the parents once again reported, or caregivers once again reported, altered behavior and excessive friendliness as things that we saw correlated with lower functioning or lower total scores. So in summary, kind of what did we just look at, right? Just a bunch of numbers, but really what we saw was that we had 44% that reported their kids were excessively friendly, and out of those 44%, and we saw that population correlated with lower cognitive and emotional functioning, lower family relationships and daily activities, and also the scores were correlated with lower total impact scores, which is kind of the total average score of all the different dimensions. Once again, parents reported that 42% of their kids had altered behavior or aggressive behavior. And again, with that, what we had correlated was lower social and emotional functioning. We had parents report lower communication, family relationships, and daily activity scores, as well as the total impact scores. So a lot of scores significantly being lower and correlating with parents reporting that their kids having aggressive behavior, excessive friendliness, which, at first it was definitely a surprise. And I will open up the floor later to questions and thoughts from all of you. But we actually also looked at results. So if you recall, Todd did a study a couple years ago where he sent out surveys and just kind of saw he did a quality of life survey for caregivers, and I was able to get some of those results and look at them and see if anything popped up that was similar from both our results. And there were several different things, but not to bombard you with all the data, we kind of picked out some of the things that we wanted to highlight, and that was that in his study, 39% of caregivers reported that they felt like they didn't have the sufficient skills to manage their kids' behavior, kids, with 1p36. So it's pretty significant when you're looking at almost half the people reporting that their kids have these challenging behaviors, and then again, a little bit less than half reporting that they felt, no, we don't have the skills to deal with these behaviors. So that kind of makes sense. No wonder a lot of these scores are lower for this, because if you feel like you can't manage something that may be coming up on a day-to-day basis, it can certainly take a toll at times. So where does all of this leave us, right? In terms of we looked at the study, we have these information, so what next? Well, our goal kind of was, first of all, what we did was we highlighted the involvement of behavioral challenges as a major cause of strain or distress in the families. I think, we've had a lot of studies talk about the physical features and what goes on developmentally and kind of different characteristics, but this was kind of the first time we said, behavioral concerns are also a big issue for caregivers. And that's also something that they'd talked about as evidence from the data we gathered. And additional services, things like counseling for families, for caregivers, even for siblings, or psychoeducational opportunities, which is basically when you would have parents and you would basically caregivers and teach them what are some methods to handle difficult behaviors, could be quite useful. And then finally, we also have, just providing emotional support to caregivers by healthcare providers. When we see, if this information is out there, and hopefully it will be within the year, and if we have it published, when caregivers get a new patient that has 1p36 and they do some research to see what's going on and they find these results, they know that, they could all, in addition to all the medical concerns and all the help they can provide in that way, there's also other things that they can pay attention to. Provide that essential emotional support to parents, let them know what are other challenges that are going on. And finally, healthcare professionals themselves can provide that anticipatory guidance that we talked about earlier, letting them know about potential stresses that can go on, because whether it's a new parent that just got a diagnosis or if it's a parent who's lived with a diagnosis for several years or a caregiver, I think both would like to know what are some of the challenges that go on, and also just in general, what are something other people are going through as well, and not feel that isolation of maybe, how come my kid is always acting out? How come this is happening always to me? But anyways, so with all of this information that we have, I want your thoughts. So I do want I want you to ask questions, but I also want to know if any of this information surprised anyone in terms of the behavioral challenges being the biggest highlight for us. And after that, I also would like to ask if you have any thoughts on what kinds of services you would like to see to fill this gap, whether it's with behavioral challenges or if it's anything else that we didn't necessarily talk about. What do you think are services, or what can we as healthcare providers do, or that is not being done right now, that would be helpful? And if we get some feedback, we can definitely include that in the publication as well, especially if it's a little bit detailed in terms of what it is that parents are looking for. And then finally, there's a lot of other data as well in this study that I didn't put today in hopes of not putting everyone to sleep today. But what we can do is, hopefully within the year, this information will be out there, and you can look at the numbers in detail, and everything will be out there so that you can kind of read over some of our other findings that weren't included today in the discussion and everything, and get an idea of kind of what's going on in the community. Thank you.
Okay. So while we've got Renya here, and I'll share with you a little bit of the survey data that we did a couple of years ago, but you just got a lot of download of some significant scientific research. Want to know your thoughts. So do you have any questions? Do you have any observations? Do you have any concerns? Just what are your general reactions to this? And I'll pass around the mic to anybody who wants to contribute. I think Lily has given her opinion. Okay.
Yesterday, we indicated that communication was a key to getting behavior in place, and you didn't touch on any of that. So that would be my suggestion, is to include how many words we're getting out of the kids, in their activities and whatnot. I think that's crucial. And sign language, helping the parents to develop. Baby sign was formed by these children. If you pay attention, and you study language, that they do that naturally. So I think that's a key thing that we need to help encourage the families to be aware of and learn.
Thank you. So just to clarify, you're saying that, you want information out there saying that we want to teach kids sign language, or we want to teach these kids ways of communicating early on so we can have ways to communicate with them when they are exhibiting some of those behavioral challenges.
Yeah, I can't hear everything you say, but yeah, that's the key thing, because if the child is frustrated, the activities change and the response back and forth. They have to be able to tell you what they need, what they want, how they hurt, how they feel, and the family basis is improved by having that communication. If the kids can't communicate and the frustration is the acting out and the behavioral, that's where, in my opinion, as Nana, and having watched for going on 10 years now, that is his biggest frustration, is he can't tell you what it is he needs or where he hurts or anything. And you didn't address that on the family behavior.
Thank you.
Okay. Always has to be at the other side of the room. It was a joke.
As far as the study went, I thought it's obvious that when you have behavioral challenges with your kids, the parents it's going to be very high stress for the families. What I would like to see in a future study or a follow-up study, a lot of us are starting to go through ABA therapy. We had a whole panel yesterday, behavioral therapy. Maybe follow up after you go through the behavioral therapy or get some of those types of therapies, does that level of stress go down, over time? It would be interesting to see. Because like she was saying, communication's a huge piece that goes into behavior, which goes into stress levels for the family. It's just like this never-ending circle. And I would be interested to see over time, the more families that can get behavioral type therapy over time, does that level of stress go down? So that's just a future thought.
Thank you.
Renya, was there any correlation between assistance from providers and levels of stress, or did you notice any trend one way or the other?
We didn't specifically look at that, but I think there was definitely, individuals who said they felt like they had a lot of help at work, or they had extra help maybe from Nana, Grandpa, or more extended family members did show some lower levels of stress. But also other people at the same time had also mentioned that even though they had these external family members that were helping out, it wasn't always the easiest communicating with everyone, and kind of family relationships were sometimes a mess because everyone was trying to coordinate a million things at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, guys, show of hands. How many people, when you're describing your child's condition, get fatigued and even stressed out as you're describing it? Show me your hands. Yes? Yes? And every time I do it, it seems to get even more tiring because what's the story and how do you explain it? The way I describe it to people is average couple with no kids, stress level about here. Average family with kids, stress level about here. Average 1p36 family, stress level about here. Does that sound accurate? Yeah. Okay, definitely, right? Can I get an amen on that? Okay. All right, did I see another hand back here? Okay.
Our family is represented under the seizure category, and we experience infantile spasms, but it seems like a lot of the other kids that have seizure episodes as well don't have typical seizures by a lot of medical standards. And I know for us, we've encountered 3 different medical physicians that didn't believe us when we told them our son was having seizures because they didn't look like what they're used to. And so from a parent standpoint, in trying to educating the medical profession as a whole, I think that's really important. And I think we've found personally a lot of kids with gene mutations especially have kind of special seizures. And so getting the word out to that population just to make taking our kids into different hospitals sometimes when we have to a little bit easier on us and our children especially.
I agree. Thank you. And that's really important because, a lot of times if you're seeing a specialist that knows about seizures, or a specialist, you're going for heart or for so on, not a lot of people know what's going on completely in a kid that has 1p36. So, the least someone can do is maybe just pull up Google and say, what is this? What are some other things that could be going on? And that's why, we're hoping to get more and more publications out about 1p36, so it's not such a foreign concept to people in different healthcare professions when they see this, or when they hear about this, or where they get a patient that has maybe seizures and they're not familiar with the rest of the things that are going on.
Other questions, other observations?
Over there.
A lot of you people have observed Brady, my granddaughter here, and you can see what a friendly, just overly friendly child she is. And one of the reasons there's a lot of stress in this family is because she can be like this with crowds or with even strangers when she's just so friendly and so happy. And when she gets home, she just turns the opposite direction. And you think, how do you relate to that when she can be so happy, and yet, it's almost like she turns on the people that love her the most. And this is a very stressful situation.
Thank you for sharing that.
How many people have that experience where Jen is back there? Yes, Colin, for sure. Raise your hand if your child is wonderful with other people, but is the devil incarnate in your house. Yeah, okay, that's fairly common. Good, at least we're not alone. That's great.
Hi, I'm Teresa Estrada. I'm a grandmother. And this is our first conference, so it's really emotional for us. And it brought to mind, thank you. It brought to mind when you talked about having to retell your story. And part of that, and I've heard it with not only my daughter, but with Ana Maria, and also with, I believe, Scott, when they were first told about what their child had, how traumatic that was. And she relives it every single time. And I think professionals, the doctors, whoever got the opportunity, the terrible opportunity to have to tell them, didn't give it one more day to find the right person to tell them the correct way. Every time she tells her story, she relives that. So it's so callous of people not taking the time to find the appropriate person to tell the parents this shocking thing that they're going to have to retell every single time. So it's part of their story, and I think it's so important for the medical professionals to understand you don't take this, with just a grain of salt. You have to really take the time to tell a family something that impacts them for life. So,
Thank you, and I agree. I think that a medical professional may be telling a family some type of news for the third, fourth time that week, but for that family, that's the once-in-a-lifetime information they're getting, and that's what sticks with them for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, every time they relive that, every time someone asks, what's 1p36? And I can't imagine, the fatigue you were talking about, because just working on this project for the last 2 years, people would ask me, what are you working on? And I would say, family impact of 1p36. And they'd say, what is 1p36 deletion syndrome? Because obviously they've never heard of it. And just explaining it to them alone, I've been like, this is what it is, several times. And, I don't, as much as I love these kids and I see them, I don't have that connection that the caregivers do to these kids. And even that can be a lot. So I can't imagine what the parents go through when they're talking, and it's their kids, and it's them that got that information, whatever amount of years ago, but it still stays.
Hi, in your slide, you said that 39% of the parents didn't feel equipped to deal with the behavior challenges. And I'm wondering, did you have a control group, and do you know what that percentage is for the general population? Because it seems that probably a higher percentage of my friends with typically developed children don't have those skills either. So I'm wondering, do we really have a higher percentage of feeling inadequate, or is that just the nature of being a parent in general?
That's absolutely true. I think, with a lot of what we talked about today, also a lot of parents who have typical children feel similarly when their kids lash out, when their kids have these concerns. But I think kids with 1p36 do have some more challenging behaviors. But in terms of not feeling equipped to deal with that, you're absolutely correct. It could be that other parents are feeling the same way too. We didn't have a control population. Actually, that specific number was from Todd's data that he collected a few years ago.
And that was specifically from our group. Yeah. Okay, so just to add to that, speaking of that survey, just wanted you guys to go over the survey we did back in 2013, which is kind of the precursor to the more scientific study that was done. These are the general summary and conclusion. I'm not going to go over all the data. I can make that available to you if you're interested. But when I surveyed our community, these are the conclusions that I came up with from the data. So I don't think any of this is going to surprise you guys, but just to let you know, we share a lot of commonality in our experience, but there is variety. So for instance, in terms of the challenges that each kid faces, They're unique to the child. There's not, two children that are completely identical and all the challenges that they bring and that they have to deal with. Secondly, not all of us receive the services and support that we need, whether that's from a professional provider or whether that's from extended family or whether that's from other institutions that we've reached out to. So some of us are better positioned to do it. Some of us have a greater network to do it. Some of us are physically isolated in parts of the country that or other countries that don't provide those services. So equal access is not, there's no standard, right? We do not engage in enough self-care. Hold your hand up if you've ever lost sleep. Okay, this week, hold your hand up if you've lost sleep not because of mom and dad's night out. Okay, right, exactly. We are sleep deprived, right? We self-sacrifice all the time. I look up self-sacrifice in the dictionary, you'll find my wife's picture, swear to God, right? Because we always put our children first, and not just our 1p36er. If you have multiple children, of course you do, right? So we end up neglecting ourselves, which make us less effective as caregivers. So that's one thing I really want to emphasize from the survey data. We need more information about managing the future needs of our child. So we were thinking about talking about special needs trusts in this conference, or conservatorship, or all of these other subjects about, especially for children who are lower on the spectrum, how do we take care of them in the future? Because we are so focused in the here and now that it's really hard to think that far ahead, because it's very anxiety provoking. I don't know about you guys, but I can tell you myself, blood pressure's already up here, right? So thinking about the future is difficult. Immediate families are helping out. Extended families, not as familiar with our challenges, right? And they can even be fairly close extended family members, but when you're not in the house, when you're not dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, when it's not in your face for 12 hours a day, they're sympathetic, but not necessarily empathetic, if you know what I mean there. Our social lives definitely negatively impacted. I used to have so many friends. I used to go out. So, I joke about that. I do have friends, and I do get out. But I think they're all in this room right now, right? You're my only friend, Jason. So so you know what I'm talking about, right? Which is why it's even more important to attend events like this. Our work life negatively impacted. You guys can think about how some of us have sympathetic bosses, some of us don't, right? And some of us plain can't work and still provide the needed care, right? And then our psychological well-being has been negatively affected. Higher rates of depression, or at least reported rates of depression, anxiety, and what you were describing just a moment ago, that sounds like PTSD. That's like, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is you had a life traumatic event and you keep reliving it. That's actually a clinical diagnosis, right? So recognize that we are impacted as caregivers. And Renya's study is one of the first, actually, if not the first, I'm not sure, about the first scientific study of our population and the needs of it. And then Rob will give you real information.
This is not only one of the first studies of this population. We looked for comparison populations that had similar questions asked, and there's like 2 or 3 papers on this topic. If you're dealing with a child with long-term care needs, what does that do to your family dynamics, and how can the healthcare system impact that? And this is a fairly novel idea. It seems like it should have been something we've paid attention to for decades, but this is one of the first studies of this nature.
Yeah, so hats off to Dr. Hopkins and Renya for really being pioneering in this area. We owe them a great debt of gratitude, I think. So let's give them a big hand. Okay, we have a few minutes left. Does anybody have any other questions or observations for Renya while we've got her here? Going once, going twice. All right, sold.
All right. Well, I'll be around for the rest of the day if anybody wants to approach me and just chat as well. I'll be here for a little bit, so thank you again.